Chapter 14. On the Road Again. Charlie clung to the dashboard in front of him for dear life as the Mexico Blue Porsche 911 took the turn at 60 miles per hour, its tires hugging the asphalt as its entire chassis forcibly leaned onto one side, sending the two Korean girls sitting on Charlie's lap, bare legs, mini-skirts, tube tops and all, flying toward the passenger side door. He felt skin and leather and nails as the girls laughed and struggled to right themselves. On the other side of him, Roger Ver, the Bitcoin Jesus who was behind the Porsche's steering wheel, was laughing too. "Keep it together, guys!" Ver shouted over the loud K-pop that was blaring out of the Porsche's speakers. "Don't want anyone breaking any laws before we make it to the restaurant. I've already seen the inside of a California prison, and I don't intend to see another one. At least not before Charlie tries the Meat Jun at Omagari. It will blow his already blown mind." Charlie helped the girls back on top of each other. It was a good thing that both of them were small, even smaller than Charlie, because when Ver had first told him they were stopping to pick up a couple of friends on the way to Omagari, he had thought the guy was joking. No way 4 people could fit in the front of a Porsche 911, and there was no back seat. When he and Ver had pulled up to the girls' apartment at the edge of Santa Clara's Koreatown, a stretch of El Camino Real dubbed Sun Dubu-ro, after the famous tofu stew in Korean cuisine, and lined with Korean restaurants, supermarkets, dry cleaners, and other Korean businesses, Charlie had been relieved to see that neither of the girls was over 5 feet. Both were decked out in silk skirts and midriff-bearing tops. The girls seemed perfectly happy sitting on Charlie's lap for the short ride over to the restaurant in nearby San Jose's Japantown, a historic 8-block section of downtown, and one of the only 3 remaining Japantowns in the country. Which put Charlie right in the middle, both knees jammed against the dashboard, and his left thigh pressing tightly against the gearshift. "Sorry," one of the girls said, her voice heavy with a Korean accent, her bright red lips swollen beneath cliff-like cheekbones. "I hope I didn't crush anything important." "Careful," Ver coughed. "Charlie is a nice Jewish boy. I should have never tried to mix him up with girls like you two." The girls laughed again, and Charlie felt his cheeks growing red. Maybe it was the motion of the car, maybe the strong perfume the girls were wearing, or the bare legs next to him, but he was experiencing an uncharacteristic lack of words. Both he and Ver were fast talkers. When he and Ver spoke on the phone, it was a battle to see who could get more words in before the final bell. But tonight, Charlie was definitely off his game. He had always been a bit socially awkward around girls, but this was something different. Besides the car and the perfume and all that skin, he could think of a couple of reasons why that might be. Things hadn't been going great at home in Brooklyn, which was part of why he had jumped at the chance to go west, to San Jose, for a series of Bit-Instant pitch meetings, all of which had been arranged by the Winklevoss twins, followed by a Bitcoin conference nearby, which they'd all agreed to attend. Ver, Bitcoin Jesus himself, had flown into the conference from Japan, his home base. Although Charlie had never met Ver in person, when Ver had first invested in Bit-Instant, over the past few months they'd grown much closer, and had been face-to-face a handful of times. Still, he was thrilled at the opportunity to catch up. Charlie had begun to see Ver as more than just a business colleague, an investor, but as a real friend, an advisor not just in the world of Bitcoin, but also in life. Life, for Charlie, was getting more complicated by the day. "The operative word is Jewish," Charlie finally said, "not Catholic. Our guilt has nothing to do with sex. It's all about our mothers." Charlie's joke had more truth to it than he'd like to have admitted. At home, things between Charlie and his mother had been going downhill for months, coinciding with his company's rise. He was still living in the basement, but he'd stopped going to temple with his family every Saturday, and when he was out, usually at dinner with Voorhees or Ira or one of his other employees, he certainly wasn't keeping kosher. Maybe it was all the time he'd spent hanging out with Voorhees or Skyping with Ver, or maybe it was his getting out of the basement more and more, but he had begun questioning everything that he had taken for granted growing up. People didn't think of Orthodox Jews the way they thought about other fundamentalist religious groups, but to Charlie, his mother's views and his Brooklyn community had begun to feel more and more suffocating, more and more like a cult. It was back in college when he'd started to see travel as an escape from that life. Because of the relationships he'd made online, he'd had the opportunity to visit different areas of the world, and whenever he was in a different city or country, he'd reinvent himself as someone living without the restrictions of his religion. But as soon as he got back to New York, he would bend back to his upbringing. Lately, however, the invented Charlie was seeming more like the real Charlie. "Here we go," Veer said, pulling the Porsche up to the curb and hitting the brakes hard enough to send the girls sliding off of Charlie's lap. "You think the valet takes Bitcoin?" It was something Veer had asked before every transaction he made anywhere. "Do you take Bitcoin?" Restaurants, supermarkets, convenience stores. So far, the answer was almost always no. "I'm kidding," Veer added as he opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. "There's no valet. This place is real casual. They let in all the riffraff. I like to keep it simple, no pretensions. I'll let the twins wine and dine you at the Ritz." Charlie couldn't see Veer's face because Veer was already coming around the car to let the girls out. But usually, when he mentioned Cameron and Tyler, it was followed by an eye roll. And that was the second reason Charlie felt off that evening. When he'd left the twins earlier that afternoon, after their last meeting of the day, it was obvious that they weren't thrilled that he was heading to dinner with Veer. They'd warned Charlie about getting too close to Veer, about giving too much credence to what he had to say. They'd tried to be measured about it. They were well aware that Charlie and Veer were friends, and that a part of Charlie looked up to him. But they had made it clear they were starting to worry about the potential influence Veer could have, not just on BitInstant, but also on Charlie himself. Veer started talking to the girls in Korean as he led them toward the restaurant's entrance. Charlie followed, uncurling himself from the front seat of the car and dusting himself off under the red awning. He wasn't surprised by Veer's fluency in Korean. Veer was obsessed with all things Asian, an observation confirmed by the fact that he was shuttling the Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift style between Asiatown neighborhoods, only a few hours after stepping off a plane from Tokyo. Veer was one of the smartest people Charlie had ever met, maybe the smartest, even if his views could be a little extreme. Lately, Charlie had begun to think of him as his new rabbi, to the twins' dismay. Charlie didn't think the twins had anything to worry about. If anything, the meeting the three of them had that day should have put them at ease. Charlie had been on his game. Moreover, at the moment, life was good for all of them. After Cyprus, the price of a single Bitcoin had skyrocketed to more than $100, which had made the twins a whole lot richer than they already were. They had started their bulk purchase of Bitcoin when it was below $10, which meant their investment had already appreciated by a factor of 10, a fantastic multiple by any measure. All the conversations they had in the bakery had been validated, and all their predictions were coming true. The fact that Wall Street and most of Silicon Valley were still skeptical and dismissive of Bitcoin made everything even sweeter. When Wall Street and Silicon Valley discovered the massive bet the twins had made in the new currency, God only knew how they would react. The twins were building their new empire without anyone realizing they were doing it. Certainly, the twins had to be pleased with how things were going, and especially with Charlie. But were they? As Charlie followed Veer and the girls into the half-full restaurant, watching them take one of the wooden tables by the window overlooking the street lined with Japanese groceries, magazine shops, and clothing stores, he realized what was really bothering him, even more than his troubles at home. Something deep in him wanted to impress Cameron and Tyler, and he felt that just by hanging out with Veer, he was falling short in their eyes. "You want beer? Sake? Whiskey?" Veer asked as he ushered Charlie to a seat between the girls. Veer himself didn't drink. He didn't do drugs or smoke. He was athletic, sported a near crew cut, and was built like a wrestler. He was actually a master at jiu-jitsu, who trained at a dojo right near his apartment in Tokyo. When you thought about it, he and the twins seemed to have a lot in common. The twins should have taken to him on sight, but the opposite had happened, as Charlie had seen just 24 hours ago. When Charlie had realized they'd all be in San Jose at the same time, he thought it was a perfect opportunity to get Cameron and Tyler together with Veer and let them see that he wasn't as radical as his online persona. That idea had been dead on arrival. The twins had turned the invitation down as soon as Charlie had brought it up, telling him that they needed to finish work and rest up for the following day ahead. That was when they'd both made it clear that they didn't love the idea of him continuing to hang out with Veer, even on his own. Tyler had put it simply, "Roger has said things and done things. You've got to be careful." Not having the twins' approval had hit Charlie hard. He knew it was foolish, but it was like high school all over again, with him in the role of the little guy, cross-eyed and bad at sports, a total nerd, back in the corner of the gym, with all the other losers. He shook the stupid thoughts away as he let Veer order him a whiskey. The twins weren't being bullies. They were being cautious. Their disapproval of his friendship with Veer wasn't some high-status thing. It was because they cared about him. He told himself. In the twins' estimation, Veer came with dangerous baggage, not just his radical beliefs, but his past. The way Veer told the story, and the facts seemed to back it up, Veer had been railroaded by the U.S. government, but even so, he had spent 10 months in a federal prison for selling explosive pest control products online. This fact alone was hard to look past, especially for 2 Harvard graduates from Greenwich, Connecticut. "Why don't you tell the girls why you still believe in sky people?" Veer started, once the drinks had landed, and he'd ordered some food in his facile Korean. "Or have I managed to finally win you over to reality?" Charlie smiled. Veer had been teasing him about his religious beliefs almost from the moment they'd finally met in person just a few months ago. That meeting had taken place in Austria, of all places. They had both been invited to a Bitcoin summit by a Russian founder of the Mycelium electronic wallet, who was also the entrepreneur behind Neft Vodka, the mini oil cans that Charlie kept on his desk back at the BitInstant offices in New York. Alexander Kuzmin was another great character in the world of Bitcoin. He had previously been mayor of a small town in Siberia where he had outlawed the use of excuses by any government employee. Kuzmin was now going all in on crypto and had organized the summit in Austria to learn as much as he could. Charlie had jumped at the invitation, since it had involved 2 things he loved, Bitcoin and travel. He'd ended up sharing an apartment in Vienna with Veer and Voorhees, right off the Vienna day market. They were already online friends, but getting to spend time with Veer in person had opened Charlie's mind in ways he hadn't expected. To Charlie, who was only 22, Veer seemed incredibly well-traveled and knew so much about the world. He was very open about his views, which Charlie liked about him. The guy wasn't just trying to fit in. He was a true believer who wasn't afraid to say just what he meant in every situation. The first night out in Vienna, they'd ended up at a nightclub filled with girls who weren't exactly prostitutes, but close enough. Veer had paid the women little attention. "I've never slept with a white girl before. I only sleep with Asian women. Just can't break the habit." Charlie assumed it was a joke, but that opening had launched them into a conversation about how this tall white guy from California had ended up in Japan in the first place, and it had all gone back to that stint in prison. The way Veer explained it, he'd been taken down because of his ideology. He'd been selling what were essentially fireworks over the internet, actually firecrackers manufactured by a company called Pest Control Report 2000 that had been selling the product online for 3 years without problems. But Veer wasn't the only one selling them, just the only one arrested. Not coincidentally, at the ripe age of 21, he had just run for the California State Assembly as a candidate for the Libertarian Party. Already a big believer in individual freedom and the notion that government used the threat of violence to get people to behave, he took part in a debate during the election, at which the local head of the DEA was present. During the debate, Veer had essentially called the DEA a bunch of Nazis and jackbooted thugs. 2 weeks later, he had been arrested in brutal fashion. Surrounded by men with drawn guns, taken down by DEA agents for selling pest control that the government classified as illegal explosives. Veer had sold around 200 of the devices, The company he'd bought them from had itself sold 800,000 without permits, and nobody had gotten arrested. The company that manufactured the device had sold millions, and again, nobody had gotten arrested. But Veer did get arrested, and when he went to jail, it wasn't some cushy federal camp. It was a medium-security institution, the real deal. Veer's 10-month stint in prison had been an enormous wake-up call. What he'd previously thought of as a theoretical and philosophical battle with overreaching government had suddenly become very real. As he told it, he'd been trying to make the world a better place by pushing libertarian ideals, and it had gotten him thrown in jail. At first, he'd spent his time in prison studying, reading every libertarian book he could find. Both before prison and during, he'd taken to the works of Murray Rothbard, a major 20th century thinker who was a founder of the ideology of anarcho-capitalism and basically called for the elimination of the centralized state in favor of individual liberty. Rothbard believed that anything the government could do, the private sector could do better. More radically, he argued that the government was robbery systematized and writ large. He especially was against banks and thought of the Federal Reserve as a form of fraud. Veer's arrest and imprisonment had also taught him a different valuable lesson. His views could get him in trouble, and the freedoms most people took for granted weren't as guaranteed as people thought. As soon as Veer got out of prison, he'd moved his business and himself straight to Japan. By that point, the computer company he'd built before his imprisonment, Memory Dealers Inc., an online retailer of computer memory chips, had made him a millionaire, and he'd had enough of living in the United States. For nearly a decade, though his views had remained as radical as ever, he'd stayed pretty much silent, living abroad while beginning the process of giving up his U.S. citizenship. He didn't really want to be a citizen of anywhere. He, like Voorhees, didn't believe in borders and states. He'd been content being a silent citizen of the world. And then he'd discovered Bitcoin. Veer first heard of Bitcoin around 2010, listening to a radio show associated with the New Hampshire Free State movement called Free Talk Live. At first, Veer hadn't paid much attention to it, but when Bitcoin had come up again a few months later on the same radio show, he'd decided to do some research. The more he'd read about Bitcoin, the more he'd started to realize that its design and the technology behind it dovetailed beautifully with his beliefs. More than that, Veer had grown up reading and loving science fiction, and Bitcoin sounded exactly like the cybercash or credits that featured in so much of the genre. And since Veer was an entrepreneur in the computer sector, who had also spent years studying economic theory, he was in the perfect position to understand what Bitcoin was and where it could go. He'd begun accumulating the digital currency at a rapid pace. Nobody was exactly sure how many Bitcoin he'd bought, but there were plenty of rumors that his stash might have been even larger than the twins. And along with his growing fortune, Veer had also found his voice again through Bitcoin. It was so exactly suited to his ideological beliefs. From their very first meeting, Veer had been proselytizing to Charlie. He'd sent him dozens of libertarian books and initiated many conversations questioning Charlie's faith in religion, government, and any other big organization that used force or fear to get its way. When Charlie would ask, "Yes, but then who will build the roads?" Veer would explain that everything in life had to be volunteered, that nothing should be forced, not even the roads. Economic and moral incentives would always be enough. In retrospect, Charlie had to admit it was no wonder that Veer and the twins did not get along. Although the twins had been let down by the legal system, they didn't want to tear it all down. The twins had grown up imbued with intense, old-world values. They were truly men of Harvard. They had lost a fight, which only meant to them that they needed to fight smarter. When you lost a race in crew, you didn't react by trying to sink all the boats. You found a way to row harder. Veer, on the other hand, believed the old-world structures were flawed, that the crew race was rigged from the beginning. The establishment was built on lies and mythology, fantasies like Charlie's sky people, interpreted by rabbis pronouncing edicts that had very little to do with the real world. Although sometimes Veer's libertarian views seemed equally distant from the real world. "Reality over sky people?" Charlie said as a steaming tray of sautéed meat landed on the table between them. "Which reality? The one where we all live in some commune and volunteer to dig roads?" Veer skillfully jabbed at the meat with a pair of chopsticks, then fed a piece to one of the Korean girls. "I don't live in a commune. I live in a beautiful apartment. And my Porsche is parked outside. Volunteerism isn't hippy-dippy, it's the opposite. We just don't need Big Brother putting a gun in our mouth to get us to do what we should do on our own." Charlie knew where that ideology led. Veer believed that taxes were essentially armed robbery, that serving in the military could be akin to forced murder, that anything you didn't choose to do on your own was the same as being coerced. Sometimes you have to try to find a middle ground. The middle ground is where ideas go to die. Veer didn't believe in compromise. It was part of what made him such a force in the Bitcoin world. From the minute he'd been turned on to Bitcoin, he'd been one of its biggest cheerleaders. But unlike the twins, he had no problem with the darker side of Bitcoin. He actually loved Silk Road. Veer didn't drink or do drugs, but he fully supported the rights of any individual to buy and sell whatever they wanted. And Charlie believed. He also saw Bitcoin as the greatest way ever invented to bypass governmental organizations, like the DEA or the IRS. "Look," Charlie said, even though he knew he was taking himself out of the moment, forgetting that he was sitting next to a pair of beautiful women, and instead imagining he was back in the BitInstant office. "If Bitcoin is ever to go mainstream, we have to build bridges, not burn them." "You sound like Cameron, or is it Tyler? You're all such statists." Veer, and Voorhees too, were always mocking Charlie as a statist, someone who believed that a government, a state, was necessary. But the way Veer said it, the word now seemed more than just a simple tease. No doubt he saw the twins as part of the establishment, part of everything he loathed. Charlie didn't think it was right to hold their privilege against them. He'd watched baseball all his life. He was a die-hard Mets fan. So what if the twins had started out life on third base? It was still hard as hell to make it home. "They're true believers like you," he said. Veer poked at another piece of grilled meat. "In what? How much money they're going to make?" As if that was such a bad thing. Charlie liked talking about the meaning of Bitcoin as much as anyone, but he considered himself an entrepreneur. At some level, weren't they all in this for the money? In Silicon Valley, every pitch deck identified a problem and proposed a solution. All of them talked about changing the world, making life better for everyone. From Facebook to Apple to Uber, they were all trying to make the world a better place. But did any of them really mean that? Charlie had to wonder. Charlie believed Veer did mean it, that Bitcoin, to him, was a weapon to remake the world. In multiple interviews, Veer had said that Bitcoin was the most important human invention since the internet. Even the twins had to respect that Roger Veer always meant what he said. The night wound down, the dinner ended, and Veer dropped Charlie back at his hotel, leaving with both girls for another party. Charlie had to ask himself, the world Roger Veer wanted to make, was it going too far? Was that a world Charlie wanted to live in?